Let's get started. Story number 1.
The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the old farmhouse. Mary adjusted the collar of her jacket and stared out into the night. She had always hated coming out to the countryside, especially in the colder months. It wasn't the isolation that unnerved her, it was the peculiar atmosphere of the place. Her husband, Tom, had inherited the property from his grandfather, and they only ever visited a couple of times a year. Yet every time they did, Mary couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was well past midnight, and Tom had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the long drive. Mary had stayed up, unable to sleep. She sipped her tea and listened to the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the living room. The sound was oddly comforting until it wasn't. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks on her, but the faint creak of footsteps on the porch was unmistakable. Mary froze, her cup hovering inches from her lips. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps moving closer to the front door. "Tom?" she called out softly, but there was no answer. Her voice felt small in the vast silence of the house. Placing her cup down, she moved to the window, careful not to draw the curtain fully back. She peered into the darkness but saw nothing beyond the faint outline of the barn and the swaying trees. The porch was empty. She let out a shaky breath, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination, when the sound came again. This time, it wasn't from the porch. It was inside the house. Mary's heart thudded painfully as she turned toward the hallway. The old floorboards groaned faintly as though someone was moving through the shadows. She wanted to wake Tom, but something told her to stay quiet. Her instincts screamed at her to stay still, to not draw attention to herself. The creaking grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving toward the living room. Mary's pulse raced as she reached for her phone, only to realize she had left it in the bedroom. She cursed under her breath, her mind racing with what to do. The doorway to the living room was dark, framed by the faint glow of the hallway nightlight. Slowly, a shadow appeared, tall, unnaturally thin, and impossibly still. It didn't step forward. It just stood there, as if it were waiting for her to acknowledge it. Mary's breath hitched as she stared, her fingers digging into the arm of the couch. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if curious. And then, without warning, it stepped forward into the dim light. Mary gasped. Its face, or lack thereof, was a pale, featureless expanse. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, sickly white skin stretched over an elongated skull. She scrambled back, knocking over the teacup. The crash broke the silence, and the thing jerked its head toward the sound. It moved then, quick and fluid, like a shadow slipping through the room. Mary bolted for the bedroom, her bare feet skidding on the hardwood floor. "Tom!" she screamed, throwing the door open. Tom shot up, groggy and confused. "What's wrong?" "There's someone in the house!" she gasped, slamming the door behind her. She locked it and backed away, her hands trembling. Tom was out of bed in an instant, his face set in a mix of disbelief and concern. "What are you talking about? Did you see someone?" "Yes, it's not." She stopped, struggling to find the words. "It's not human, Tom. There's something wrong with it." Before he could respond, there was a loud bang on the bedroom door, followed by a deep, guttural scraping sound like nails dragging down the wood. Mary pressed herself against the wall, her chest heaving as Tom grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The banging grew louder, more frantic. The door shuddered under the force, the lock rattling as though it wouldn't hold much longer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Tom approached the door cautiously, the bat raised. He placed his ear against it, listening. "I don't hear anything," he whispered. Mary shook her head, her instincts screaming at her that it wasn't over. "Don't open it." But Tom, ever the skeptic, slowly unlocked the door. He cracked it open and peered into the hallway. "There's nothing here," he said, turning back to her. The moment he spoke, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Mary screamed as something cold and clammy brushed past her, moving with an unnatural swiftness. Tom swung the bat wildly, hitting nothing but air. The room felt alive with movement, shadows swirling and shifting in the darkness. "Mary, get out of the house!" Tom shouted. his voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers that filled the room. She fumbled for the window, yanking it open and climbing out onto the frosty grass below. Turning back, she saw Tom struggling in the dim moonlight, the bat swinging uselessly as the shadowy figure enveloped him. His screams cut off abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Mary staggered back, tears streaming down her face. The house loomed before her, dark and foreboding. She wanted to run, to never look back, but something held her in place. And then she saw it. In the upstairs window, the figure stood, its pale, featureless face pressed against the glass. It raised a hand slowly, pointing directly at her. Behind it, Tom appeared, his eyes wide and vacant, his mouth moving as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. The figure turned to him, and the room was swallowed by darkness. Mary ran then, her legs carrying her as far from the house as they could. She didn't stop until she reached the main road, where a passing truck finally picked her up. She begged the driver to take her to the nearest police station, her words tumbling out in frantic bursts. When the authorities arrived at the farmhouse the next morning, they found no sign of Tom or anyone else. The house was empty, the furniture undisturbed. The only thing they found was Mary's spilled teacup in the living room and a single handprint on the bedroom door. Too large to belong to any human, its fingers impossibly long and clawed. Mary never returned to the farmhouse. She sold it a year later, but the locals still tell stories about the strange happenings on that stretch of road. Some claim to have seen lights in the windows late at night. Others say they've heard whispers carried on the wind. And a few swear they've seen a tall, faceless figure standing by the edge of the woods, waiting for its next visitor. Story the end.
Story number 2.
Here's a draft of the story. Let me know if you'd like changes or additional details. In the dead of night, the air hung thick with an unnatural stillness. A lone gas station blinked weakly on the outskirts of town, its neon sign casting a pale glow on the empty highway. Nathan Conroy's rusting pickup truck sputtered to a stop in front of the pumps, the engine groaning as if it, too, sensed something amiss. Nathan was a man hardened by years of solitude, his life one long road of temporary stops and fleeting connections. But this place, this night, felt different. The clock on the dashboard read 3:07 a.m., the time when the world seemed to slip into a liminal space where reality blurred. As he stepped out of the truck, the crunch of his boots on the gravel sounded deafening in the silence. The gas station's windows were caked with dust, and a flickering bulb above the entrance created shadows that seemed to stretch and shiver. The door jingled as Nathan entered, the sound echoing unnaturally in the small, cluttered space. Behind the counter sat an old man with hollow cheeks and eyes clouded by age. He looked up as Nathan approached, his gaze lingering just a moment too long. "Late to be out on these roads," the old man rasped, his voice dry as paper. "Not many travelers come through here anymore." Nathan nodded, grabbing a bag of chips and a bottle of water from the shelves. "Just passing through. Had some engine trouble. Is there a mechanic nearby?" The old man shook his head slowly. "Not at this hour. But you don't want to linger here too long. These roads..." He trailed off, his eyes darting toward the window. "Strange things happen in the dead of night." Nathan smirked, brushing off the comment. "I'll be on my way soon, just need some gas." The old man's hand trembled as he took Nathan's cash. "Careful now. The night's darker than it seems." Nathan felt a chill creep up his spine, but he dismissed it as fatigue. He filled up his truck and was back on the road within minutes, the gas station's dim light fading in his rearview mirror. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the dense woods on either side. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to press closer, suffocating. It wasn't long before he noticed something strange. The odometer wasn't ticking up as it should, and the scenery outside looked identical. Mile after mile, the same gnarled trees and crumbling road signs flashed past. He slowed the truck, checking his GPS, but the screen was blank, an unending searching for signal. Nathan's pulse quickened. He knew he wasn't imagining it. He pulled over, stepping out into the chilly night air. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant call of a lone owl. He walked a few paces down the road, his flashlight sweeping over the asphalt. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the distance. It was a woman, her pale dress billowing as though caught in an invisible breeze. She was motionless, her face obscured by shadows. Nathan's throat tightened as an irrational fear gripped him. He called out, his voice trembling. "You okay, miss? Do you need help?" She didn't move. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to get back in the truck, but something compelled him forward. As he approached, the air grew colder, each breath fogging in front of him. The woman's head tilted slightly, and a low, guttural sound filled the air, sending a jolt of terror through him. He froze. Suddenly, she vanished, gone as if she had never been there. Nathan staggered backward, his flashlight shaking in his hand. The darkness around him seemed alive, shifting and whispering. He spun around and sprinted back to his truck, heart pounding like a war drum. He slammed the door shut and turned the key. The engine roared to life, but the headlights flickered, casting distorted shadows on the road. As he accelerated, the shadows seemed to follow, twisting and writhing in his peripheral vision. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, driving faster than he should on the winding road. Then, out of nowhere, a deafening thud rocked the truck. Nathan slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the vehicle skidded to a halt. His heart was in his throat as he stepped out to inspect the damage. The hood of the truck was dented, but there was no sign of what he'd hit. No animal, no debris, just nothing. As he stood there, the air grew unnaturally quiet again. A chill ran down his spine as he realized he wasn't alone. Slowly he turned, and there she was, standing in the middle of the road, closer this time. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. Nathan didn't think. He ran back to the truck, throwing it into reverse. The tires spun on the gravel before gaining traction, and he sped backward until he was a safe distance away. But as he shifted into drive, the woman appeared again, directly in front of the truck. Her face was impossibly close, staring through the windshield with hollow eyes. He screamed, slamming on the gas. The truck surged forward, but it was as though he was driving through molasses. The woman's laughter, cold, hollow, and inhuman, filled the cab, even though the windows were shut. He gritted his teeth, muttering prayers he hadn't spoken in years. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The truck broke free of the unseen resistance, and the road ahead stretched out, normal and unbroken. Nathan didn't dare slow down. He drove for what felt like hours until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. He pulled into a diner at the edge of a small town, his hands still shaking. Inside, the waitress eyed him with concern as he ordered coffee. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," Nathan muttered, staring into the steaming cup. "You came from the north, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low. Nathan looked up sharply. "How'd you know?" She leaned in, her expression grave. "That stretch of road, people say it's cursed. They see things, hear things. Most don't make it out." Nathan's blood ran cold. He didn't respond, just downed his coffee and left a crumpled bill on the counter. As he walked back to his truck, he glanced at the road ahead, the morning sun casting long shadows, but in the rearview mirror, the shadows behind him still moved.
Story number 3.
It was the dead of night when Sarah's car sputtered to a halt on the desolate country road. The trees on either side loomed like skeletal sentinels, their barren branches clawing at the starless sky. Her phone had died hours ago, and the nearest town was miles away. The silence pressed in, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves carried by a cold, creeping wind. Shivering, Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The beam of light illuminated the cracked asphalt and the edges of the surrounding forest, where shadows danced like specters. She decided to walk, hoping to find a house or a phone to call for help. Each step echoed unnaturally in the stillness, the sound swallowed by the oppressive dark. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint light ahead, flickering through the trees. Relief washed over her as she approached a dilapidated house, its wooden frame warped and weathered by time. The light came from a single lantern hanging by the door. Hesitating only briefly, she knocked, the sound reverberating eerily. The door creaked open on its own. "Hello?" Sarah called, her voice trembling. No answer came, but the door swung wider, revealing a dimly lit interior. Against her better judgment, she stepped inside. The air was thick with a musty odor, as if the house had been abandoned for decades. Dust motes swirled in the lantern's glow, and the floorboards groaned beneath her weight. "Is anyone here?" She tried again. A faint sound drifted from upstairs, an indistinct whisper, almost too faint to hear. Her pulse quickened as she strained to listen. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Her name. Sarah. Her breath hitched. She hadn't told anyone her name. Panic surged, but something compelled her forward. Climbing the creaking staircase, she followed the sound to a door at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, revealing a room bathed in pale moonlight. Inside was a single chair facing the window. A figure sat there, unmoving, its back to her. "Hello?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned its head slightly, enough for her to glimpse a pale, hollow face. The eyes were sunken pits of darkness, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped. The lantern's light flickered violently, and the house seemed to groan as if alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. She screamed, spinning around, but there was no handle on the inside, just smooth, cold wood. The figure rose from the chair with a fluid, inhuman motion. "Stay," it hissed, and the room plunged into darkness. Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, but when she clicked it on, the beam revealed nothing but the empty chair. Her heart pounded as she turned back to the door, now slightly ajar. She bolted into the hallway, the floorboards beneath her feet shifting as if trying to trip her. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking grotesque, almost human shapes. She stumbled down the stairs, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The front door was within reach, but when she grasped the knob, it burned her hand, forcing her to let go. A guttural laugh echoed through the house. "Stay with us?" The voices whispered, overlapping in a chilling chorus. Desperate, Sarah turned and ran deeper into the house. She found herself in a kitchen, the counters covered in cobwebs and rusted utensils. A heavy chill filled the air as the whispers grew louder. One by one, the drawers and cabinets began to open and close, slamming with deafening force. She spotted a back door and lunged for it, wrenching it open and spilling into the cold night. Her legs pumped as she ran blindly into the forest, branches tearing at her skin. The house loomed behind her, its windows glowing with an unholy light. The whispers followed her, growing more frantic. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, she realized the forest was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. She shone her flashlight around, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Then she heard it again. Her name, Sarah. It came from everywhere and nowhere. She spun in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, when a hand cold, bony, and impossibly strong grabbed her wrist. She screamed, dropping the flashlight. The light rolled, illuminating a face inches from hers. It was the same hollow visage from the house, its grin wider now, stretching impossibly across its face. "You can't leave," it said, its voice a guttural growl. Sarah thrashed, pulling free and grabbing the flashlight. She ran again, her lungs burning, tears streaming down her face. She didn't stop until she saw the faint outline of her car ahead. Relief flooded her as she reached it, fumbling with the door and collapsing inside. She locked the doors and turned the key. The engine roared to life. She glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. In the back seat sat the figure, its grin wider than ever, its eyes glowing like dying embers. "You're ours now," it whispered. The car lurched forward on its own, speeding down the road as the figure's laughter filled the cabin. The headlights revealed the road ahead, but no matter how far she drove, she passed the same trees, the same bends, over and over. It was as if the road was looping endlessly. Sarah's screams echoed into the night, unheard by anyone. The car eventually disappeared, swallowed by the dark woods. To this day, travelers on that lonely stretch of road speak of strange whispers and flickering lights in the distance. Some say they've seen a woman running through the trees, her flashlight beam bobbing like a ghostly lantern, but no one who has followed her has ever returned. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was the dead of night when Michael Evans found himself driving along the old country road, his headlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. He'd taken this route many times before, a shortcut through the rural outskirts to get home faster. But tonight felt different. The radio had given out miles ago, leaving only the rhythmic hum of the tires on the cracked pavement and the occasional hoot of an unseen owl to fill the silence. The road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by dense woods on either side. The towering trees swayed gently in the wind, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal hands toward the sky. Michael checked the clock on the dashboard, 1:47 a.m. He was exhausted but determined to get home. A flash of movement caught his eye, and his heart skipped a beat. He hit the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a halt. Breathing heavily, he scanned the road ahead. A figure stood in the distance, illuminated by his high beams. It was a woman, her pale dress fluttering in the breeze. Michael hesitated. He was miles from the nearest town, and it was unusual to see anyone out here, let alone in the middle of the night. Rolling down his window slightly, he called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her head slightly tilted, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. Michael's unease grew. He glanced at his phone, but there was no signal. He considered driving past her, but something about the way she stood, so eerily motionless, sent a chill down his spine. Against his better judgment, he opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air prickling his skin. "Ma'am?" he called again, his voice trembling. He took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. The woman slowly turned her head to face him, and Michael froze. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. But it wasn't her appearance that terrified him. It was the way her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, far too wide for her face. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying unnaturally through the still air. Michael's instincts screamed at him to get back in the car, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The woman took a step forward, her movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. "Help me," she repeated, her voice now layered with a strange, echoing quality. Snapping out of his trance, Michael turned and bolted back to his car. He fumbled with the door handle, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and finally managed to get inside. Slamming the door shut, he locked it and shifted into gear. As he pressed the gas, the car lurched forward, but the woman was suddenly there, standing directly in front of the vehicle. Her head tilted unnaturally to one side, and her smile grew impossibly wider. Michael screamed, jerking the wheel to swerve around her. The car veered off the road and onto the shoulder, narrowly missing a tree before he regained control. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, she was gone. Michael's heart pounded as he sped down the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He told himself it was over, that he just needed to get home. But a faint whispering filled the car. So soft at first he thought it was his imagination. "Help me! Help me!" He glanced at the passenger seat, and his blood ran cold. The woman was sitting there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on him. "Stop the car," she said, her voice a low, guttural rasp. Michael's scream echoed through the night as he jerked the wheel again, the car spinning wildly before slamming to a stop in the middle of the road. When he looked at the passenger seat, it was empty. His breath came in ragged gasps as he scanned his surroundings, the darkness pressing in on him like a living thing. And then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel. Slowly, he turned his head to look out the driver's side window. The woman was there, inches from the glass, her lifeless eyes staring directly into his. She raised a hand and pressed it against the window, her smile now a hideous, gaping maw. Michael screamed again, slamming his foot on the gas. The car shot forward, and he didn't stop, didn't look back, until he saw the faint glow of a gas station up ahead. He pulled into the lot, shaking so badly he could barely park the car. The lights of the station felt like a lifeline, chasing away the oppressive darkness that had followed him. Stumbling inside, he approached the counter where an older man with a weathered face stood. "Are you all right, son?" the man asked, eyeing Michael with concern. There was a woman," Michael stammered. "She was on the road and then in my car." The man's expression darkened. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Michael stared at him, his throat dry. "What are you talking about?" The man sighed heavily, glancing out the window toward the dark road. "You're not the first. People see her out there sometimes, especially on nights like this. They call her the Dead of Night woman. Some say she's the ghost of a woman who died in a car crash on that road decades ago. Others think she's something older, something evil." Michael shook his head, his mind racing. "But she was real. She was in my car." The man nodded grimly. She's real enough, all right, but she's not alive. And if you saw her, well, you're lucky to be standing here. Michael's stomach churned. What do you mean? The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Once she's marked you, she doesn't stop. She'll follow you, haunt you. Some people say the only way to get rid of her is to face her, to find out what she wants. But no one really knows for sure. Michael stumbled back, his legs weak. He turned toward the door, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, of driving as far from this cursed place as he could. But as he reached for the handle, he froze. In the reflection of the glass, he saw her standing in the parking lot, her head tilted, her smile as wide as ever, and then the lights went out. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The forest road was silent, except for the hum of Amanda's car engine as she drove deeper into the night. She had always hated driving at night, but the call had been urgent. Her mother's frail voice had cracked over the phone, asking her to come back home to help. Something about the house, her childhood home, was wrong. The clock on her dashboard read 1:13 a.m., and her phone sat on the passenger seat, its screen dark. There was no signal out here, not on these old back roads lined with dense trees that leaned over the asphalt, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the mist that clung low to the ground. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though the woods appeared empty. She turned up the radio, seeking distraction, but only static greeted her. Sighing, she turned it off. The silence felt heavier now, oppressive, as though the night itself was pressing in on her. Her thoughts drifted to the house she hadn't visited in years, the memories of her childhood both comforting and unsettling. Her mother had always warned her about the forest at night. Never stop on these roads after dark, her mother used to say, her voice serious. Things happen in the dead of night. Amanda had always dismissed it as one of her mother's eccentricities, but now, with the oppressive quiet and the thick fog, she felt an unexplainable unease crawling up her spine. She glanced at the clock again, 1:33 a.m. How had 20 minutes passed so quickly? She couldn't recall turning any bends or crossing any landmarks. The road ahead seemed unending, the same stretch of trees and mist repeating like a looping film reel. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened as she saw something in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the road. Amanda's heart jumped. It was a woman, pale and dressed in what looked like a long white gown. The woman wasn't moving, just standing there, her head tilted slightly as though listening to the forest. Amanda slowed the car instinctively, rolling down the window just a crack. "Hey, do you need help?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. The woman didn't respond. Amanda hesitated, the hairs on her arms standing on end. Something about the way the woman stood was wrong. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, like a mannequin. Amanda's instincts screamed at her to drive away, but her sense of decency kept her foot on the brake. "Miss? Are you okay?" Still no response. The woman moved then, but not in a way Amanda expected. It was as though she was dragged backward into the woods by invisible strings, her feet gliding soundlessly over the ground. Amanda gasped, slamming her foot on the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, her hands shaking on the wheel as the figure disappeared into the fog. Her heart raced as the road stretched ahead, the shadows of the trees seeming to stretch and ripple. She told herself she was imagining things, that it was just the stress of the late hour and her mother's cryptic phone call. But as the minutes ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The road didn't look familiar anymore. The trees were thicker, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull it into the forest. And then the car sputtered. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died, leaving Amanda in complete darkness. She stared at the dashboard, her breath quickening. No, she muttered, turning the key in the ignition. The engine clicked but refused to start. Her phone had no signal. Of course. She sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, trying to think. She could wait until morning for someone to pass by, but the thought of sitting alone on this desolate road all night filled her with dread. That's when she heard it, a soft tapping on the window. Amanda froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned her head. There was nothing there. The tapping came again, louder this time, from the back window. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to look. A face was pressed against the glass. It was the woman from the road, her pale skin glowing faintly in the darkness. Her mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, and her eyes were black voids, empty and soulless. Amanda screamed, scrambling to lock the doors, but the locks clicked on their own, unlocking and locking repeatedly as though the car were possessed. The woman's head tilted to the side, her grin widening impossibly. Amanda lunged for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911, even though she knew there was no signal. The call didn't connect. The woman's face disappeared, but Amanda felt the car shift slightly, as though someone or something was climbing onto it. The roof creaked under the weight. Amanda's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the ceiling, listening. She didn't dare move. The creaking grew louder, moving toward the driver's side. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. A hand slammed against the windshield, leaving a smudge of dark liquid that dripped down the glass. The woman's face reappeared, upside down this time, staring at Amanda with that same terrible grin. Her lips moved, forming words Amanda couldn't hear but somehow understood. Run. Amanda didn't need to be told twice. She shoved open the car door and bolted into the woods, the cold air cutting at her lungs as branches tore at her clothes. She didn't look back, didn't stop to see if the woman was following. She just ran, the forest closing in around her, the darkness almost tangible. She didn't know how long she ran before she stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight revealed an old, crumbling house at its center. It looked abandoned, its windows shattered and its roof sagging. But Amanda had no other choice. She pushed open the door, her legs trembling, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and decay, and the floorboards groaned under her weight. She slammed the door shut, pressing her back against it, her chest heaving. For a moment there was silence. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Amanda backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. There was a staircase leading to the second floor, and she bolted up it, taking the steps 2 at a time. She found herself in a small bedroom, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper. She crouched in a corner, trying to make herself as small as possible. The footsteps entered the house, each one echoing like a death knell. Amanda clamped a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as the footsteps grew louder, closer. She could hear breathing now, ragged and inhuman. The bedroom door creaked open. Amanda's heart stopped. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The woman stood in the doorway, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her black eyes scanning the room. Slowly, she stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Amanda's vision blurred as she fought to stay conscious, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The woman stopped in front of her, crouching down until their faces were inches apart. Amanda felt the cold radiating from her, the smell of earth and rot filling her nostrils. The woman's lips moved again, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. You shouldn't have stopped. Amanda's scream died in her throat as the woman reached out, her fingers brushing against Amanda's cheek. The room spun, darkness consuming her as the world fell away. When Amanda woke, it was morning. She was lying in the middle of the road, her car parked a few feet away, the engine running. The forest was quiet, peaceful, as though the night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But as Amanda climbed into her car and drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching her with hollow eyes. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The clock on Ben's dashboard blinked 2:14 a.m. as his tires hummed along the deserted highway. He adjusted his rearview mirror out of habit, though there was no one behind him. The long drive back to his apartment after visiting his parents was always tedious, but tonight the road felt especially empty. He hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour. The headlights illuminated an endless stretch of asphalt bordered by dense woods. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that swayed with the wind. Ben turned the volume up on the radio, hoping the music would keep him awake, but all he got was static. His brow furrowed as he fiddled with the dial, but no matter how much he turned it, the static didn't change. With a frustrated sigh, he switched it off. The silence was suffocating. He tried to shake off the unease settling over him. It was just a lonely stretch of road in the middle of the night, Nothing unusual about that. But then his headlights flickered, once, twice, before going completely dark for a second that felt like an eternity. The engine stuttered but didn't stall. When the lights came back on, Ben felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. "Great," he muttered. "Just what I need." He told himself it was a glitch, a loose wire maybe, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened as the air in the car seemed to grow colder. He glanced at the temperature gauge on the dashboard, but it read normal. Still, the chill seeped into his skin, making him shiver. And then he saw it. Up ahead, a figure stood on the side of the road. A woman, dressed in a long, dark coat, her face obscured by shadows. Ben's foot instinctively eased off the gas as he approached. She didn't move, didn't flag him down. She just stood there, her head slightly bowed. Ben's heart pounded. He considered stopping, but something about her posture, her stillness, sent a ripple of fear through him. Instead, he veered slightly to the left, giving her a wide berth as he passed. But as he drove by, the headlights briefly illuminated her face. It wasn't a face at all. What he saw was a blur, a distorted swirl of features that refused to form anything human. Ben let out a startled gasp and pressed down on the accelerator. His car roared down the empty road, the woman vanishing in his rearview mirror. "Get a grip, Ben," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. "You're just tired. That's all." But the road didn't feel the same anymore. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows more alive. He glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. Time felt sluggish, like he'd been driving for hours without making any progress. The trees blurred past, identical and unending. And then the static started. It crackled to life without warning, pouring from his speakers, even though the radio was off. Ben winced, fumbling to turn the volume down, but the knob wouldn't move. The sound grew louder, more distorted, until it filled the car like a physical presence. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration, and the static stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was oppressive, heavy, as if the world outside had been swallowed by something unseen. Ben glanced at the rearview mirror again, and his stomach dropped. The woman was in the back seat. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was clearer now, but it was worse than the blur he'd seen before. Her skin was pale and stretched too tightly over her skull, her eyes sunk in pits of blackness. She smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of her lips that revealed teeth too sharp, too jagged to belong to any human. Ben's scream caught in his throat. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look back again, focusing on the road ahead. But the air in the car grew colder, and he could feel her gaze boring into the back of his head. The radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't static. It was a voice, soft, sing-song, and impossibly close. "Why are you running, Ben?" His name. She knew his name. Ben's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst. He pressed harder on the gas, the engine whining in protest as the speedometer climbed. The road ahead twisted and turned, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. But no matter how fast he drove, the car felt heavy, sluggish, like something was holding it back. The woman's voice came again, louder this time, almost playful. "You can't outrun me. You're already mine." The headlights flickered once more before plunging him into darkness. Ben slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as he sat in the pitch-black silence, his fingers trembling on the wheel. The woman's laughter echoed around him, low and guttural, filling the car like a suffocating fog. Ben's hands moved on their own, fumbling to open the door. He didn't care about the darkness outside. He just needed to escape the suffocating presence inside the car. He stumbled out onto the road, the cold air biting at his skin. The laughter followed him, fading into the distance as he ran blindly into the woods. Branches clawed at his arms and face, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare. When he finally collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him, he realized the laughter had stopped. The forest was deathly silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves. Just an unnatural stillness that pressed down on him like a weight. Ben's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around. The darkness was complete, suffocating. He reached for his phone, desperate for light, but when he turned it on, the screen was filled with static. And then, as he stared, the static began to shift, forming words that sent ice through his veins. "Look behind you." Ben froze, his entire body paralyzed with fear. Slowly, trembling, he turned his head. The woman stood inches away, her hollow eyes locking onto his. She didn't speak, but her smile widened, stretching unnaturally until it split her face. Ben tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw was her reaching for him, her bony fingers curling around his throat. When Ben's car was found the next morning, it was parked neatly on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, the engine still idling. But Ben was never seen again. Locals still talk about that stretch of highway, warning travelers to avoid it after dark. They call it the Dead of Night Road, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is dangerously thin. And if you ever find yourself driving there at 2:14 a.m., don't look in your rearview mirror. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was the dead of night when Eric pulled his truck onto the empty stretch of Route 47. The highway was infamous among locals for its eerie reputation. The stories ranged from shadowy figures seen in the woods to headlights that followed drivers before vanishing without a trace. Eric had always scoffed at the tales. He was a trucker, used to long nights and lonely roads, and didn't put much stock in ghost stories. The highway stretched out before him, the pavement glistening with the remnants of an earlier rainstorm. Dense forests lined either side, their silhouettes black against the moonless sky. His headlights illuminated the narrow road, cutting through the pitch darkness. The hum of the engine was his only companion as he lit a cigarette and turned up the static-filled radio, searching for a station. About 10 miles in, Eric noticed something unusual. A faint figure appeared on the shoulder of the road up ahead. At first, he thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but as he got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a woman, standing motionless in the glow of his headlights. "Damn it," Eric muttered under his breath, slowing the truck. What was someone doing out here at this hour? There wasn't another town for at least 20 miles. As the truck rolled to a stop, Eric squinted at the woman. She looked young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair that hung limply over her pale face. She wore a white dress, its fabric clinging to her as though she had been caught in the rain. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on something in the distance, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Eric rolled down his window. "Hey, you okay? You need a ride?" She didn't answer. She didn't even acknowledge him. A cold shiver ran down his spine, but he chalked it up to the chill in the air. "Listen," he said, more firmly, "you shouldn't be out here. It's dangerous. Let me give you a ride into town." The woman slowly turned her head toward him, and Eric felt his stomach drop. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. But it was her expression that unsettled him the most. Her lips were drawn into the faintest hint of a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Before he could say another word, she turned and began walking down the road, her bare feet making no sound on the wet asphalt. Eric hesitated. Every rational part of him screamed to leave her alone and keep driving, but something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, and eerily calm, drew him in. Cursing under his breath, he shifted the truck into gear and followed her at a crawl. "Hey!" he called out again, leaning out the window. "Where are you going? Let me help?" The woman didn't respond. She just kept walking, her figure illuminated by his headlights. Then, without warning, she veered off the road and disappeared into the woods. Eric stopped the truck and stared at the spot where she had vanished. The dense trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching long and dark. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the cab. The air was colder than he expected, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. "Hello?" he called, shining the beam of light into the woods. "Ma'am?" The forest swallowed his voice. He took a few hesitant steps forward, the crunch of gravel under his boots unnaturally loud. As he reached the edge of the trees, he noticed something strange. The ground was wet and muddy from the rain, but there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had walked this way. A sense of unease settled over him. He turned back toward his truck, ready to leave this unsettling encounter behind, when a faint voice stopped him in his tracks. "Help me." The whisper was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. He swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the trees, but there was no one there. "Help me," the voice came again, louder this time, and unmistakably coming from deeper in the woods. Eric's instincts told him to leave, to get back in his truck and drive until the strange encounter was nothing but a memory. But something in the voice, its desperation, its vulnerability, compelled him forward. He pushed through the underbrush, the flashlight shaking in his grip. "Where are you?" he called, his voice cracking. The whisper came again, closer now. "Help me." Eric stumbled into a small clearing and froze. In the center of the clearing was an old well, its stones slick with moss. The wooden cover was broken and rotting, and the air around it was colder than the night should have been. The flashlight flickered, and Eric smacked it against his palm, muttering a curse. "Help me," the voice echoed, this time coming from the well. He approached cautiously, peering over the edge. The darkness inside was impenetrable. The beam of his flashlight swallowed whole. The faint sound of dripping water echoed from below, but there was no sign of the woman. "Ma'am?" he called, his voice trembling. "Are you down there?" The flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, Eric thought he saw something, movement deep within the well, like a pale hand reaching up toward him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. "Help me." The voice came again, louder now, almost frantic. "Nope," Eric muttered, backing away. "This is not my problem." He turned and started back toward the truck, his pace quickening with every step. But as he neared the road, the air grew colder and the forest seemed darker than before. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely, plunging him into darkness. "Damn it," he hissed, fumbling with the flashlight. He could see the faint outline of the road ahead and the distant glow of his truck's headlights. Relief flooded him as he broke through the trees and stepped onto the asphalt. But when he looked up, the woman was standing in front of his truck, her head tilted to one side, her eyes fixed on him. "How?" Eric began, but the words caught in his throat. The woman's smile widened, her lips stretching unnaturally far. Her head tilted farther, almost to the point of snapping, and her eyes darkened until they were empty voids. She raised a hand and pointed at him. "You shouldn't have followed," she whispered, her voice no longer desperate but cold and accusing. Eric turned and ran, his boots slipping on the wet road. The sound of footsteps followed him, faster and heavier than they should have been. He glanced over his shoulder and saw her sprinting after him, her movements inhumanly fast and jerky, like a marionette on tangled strings. He reached the truck and threw himself into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled with the keys, jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he hit the gas, the tires screeching as the truck sped down the road. In the rearview mirror, the woman stood in the middle of the road, watching him with that awful, too-wide smile. As the truck gained speed, she raised her hand again and waved. Eric didn't stop driving until he reached the next town. He parked at a diner, his hands still shaking, and stumbled inside. The waitress behind the counter gave him a concerned look as he ordered coffee, his voice hoarse. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring the steaming liquid into his cup. Eric didn't answer. He couldn't bring himself to tell her what he'd seen, afraid of how ridiculous it would sound. But as he stared out the diner's window, he swore he saw a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, her white dress glowing faintly in the dark. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The clock on Ben's dashboard blinked 2:14 a.m. as his tires hummed along the deserted highway. He adjusted his rearview mirror out of habit, though there was no one behind him. The long drive back to his apartment after visiting his parents was always tedious, but tonight the road felt especially empty. He hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour. The headlights illuminated an endless stretch of asphalt bordered by dense woods. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie shadows that swayed with the wind. Ben turned the volume up on the radio, hoping the music would keep him awake, but all he got was static. His brow furrowed as he fiddled with the dial, but no matter how much he turned it, the static didn't change. With a frustrated sigh, he switched it off. The silence was suffocating. He tried to shake off the unease settling over him. It was just a lonely stretch of road in the middle of the night. Nothing unusual about that. But then his headlights flickered. Once, twice, before going completely dark for a second that felt like an eternity. The engine stuttered, but didn't stall. When the lights came back on, Ben felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. Great. he muttered. Just what I need. He told himself it was a glitch, a loose wire, maybe. But his grip on the steering wheel tightened as the air in the car seemed to grow colder. He glanced at the temperature gauge on the dashboard, but it read normal. Still, the chill seeped into his skin, making him shiver. And then he saw it. Up ahead, a figure stood on the side of the road. A woman dressed in a long, dark coat, her face obscured by shadows. Ben's foot instinctively eased off the gas as he approached. She didn't move, didn't flag him down. She just stood there, her head slightly bowed. Ben's heart pounded. He considered stopping, but something about her posture, her stillness, sent a ripple of fear through him. Instead, he veered slightly to the left, giving her a wide berth as he passed. But as he drove by, the headlights briefly illuminated her face. It wasn't a face at all. What he saw was a blur, a distorted swirl of features that refused to form anything human. Ben let out a startled gasp and pressed down on the accelerator. His car roared down the empty road, the woman vanishing in his rearview mirror. Get a grip, Ben, he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. You're just tired. That's all. But the road didn't feel the same anymore. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows more alive. He glanced at the clock, 2:37 a.m. Time felt sluggish, like he'd been driving for hours without making any progress. The trees blurred past, identical and unending, and then the static started. It crackled to life without warning, pouring from his speakers even though the radio was off. Ben winced, fumbling to turn the volume down, but the knob wouldn't move. The sound grew louder, more distorted, until it filled the car like a physical presence. He slammed his hand against the dashboard in frustration, and the static stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same. It was oppressive, heavy, as if the world outside had been swallowed by something unseen. Ben glanced at the rearview mirror again, and his stomach dropped. The woman was in the back seat. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was clearer now, but it was worse than the blur he'd seen before. Her skin was pale and stretched too tightly over her skull, her eyes sunk in pits of blackness. She smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of her lips that revealed teeth too sharp, too jagged to belong to any human. Ben's scream caught in his throat. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare look back again, focusing on the road ahead. But the air in the car grew colder, and he could feel her gaze boring into the back of his head. The radio crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't static. It was a voice, soft, sing-song, and impossibly close. Why are you running, Ben? His name. She knew his name. Ben's heart pounded so loudly he thought it might burst. He pressed harder on the gas, the engine whining in protest as the speedometer climbed. The road ahead twisted and turned, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. But no matter how fast he drove, the car felt heavy, sluggish, like something was holding it back. The woman's voice came again, louder this time, almost playful. You can't outrun me. You're already mine. The headlights flickered once more before plunging him into darkness. Ben slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as he sat in the pitch-black silence, his fingers trembling on the wheel. The woman's laughter echoed around him, low and guttural, filling the car like a suffocating fog. Ben's hands moved on their own, fumbling to open the door. He didn't care about the darkness outside. He just needed to escape the suffocating presence inside the car. He stumbled out onto the road, the cold air biting at his skin. The laughter followed him, fading into the distance as he ran blindly into the woods. Branches clawed at his arms and face, but he didn't stop. He didn't dare. When he finally collapsed, his legs giving out beneath him, he realized the laughter had stopped. The forest was deathly silent. No wind, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves. Just an unnatural stillness that pressed down on him like a weight. Ben's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked around. The darkness was complete, suffocating. He reached for his phone, desperate for light, but when he turned it on, the screen was filled with static. And then, as he stared, the static began to shift, forming words that sent ice through his veins. Look behind you. Ben froze, his entire body paralyzed with fear. Slowly, trembling, he turned his head. The woman stood inches away, her hollow eyes locking onto his. She didn't speak, but her smile widened, stretching unnaturally until it split her face. Ben tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing he saw was her reaching for him, her bony fingers curling around his throat. When Ben's car was found the next morning, it was parked neatly on the side of the road. The driver's seat was empty, the engine still idling, but Ben was never seen again. Locals still talk about that stretch of highway, warning travelers to avoid it after dark. They call it the Dead of Night Road, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is dangerously thin. And if you ever find yourself driving there at 2:14 a.m., don't look in your rearview mirror. Story the end. The end.
Story number 9.
It was a quiet October evening when Maggie first heard about the old farmhouse on Hillcrest Road. Her coworker, Dana, had casually mentioned it during lunch at the hospital, sharing a story she'd heard from her cousin. Supposedly, the house had been abandoned for decades, with no one willing to live there because of strange occurrences. "It's just superstition," Dana had said, though the nervous laugh at the end betrayed her unease. "But people swear something's wrong with that place." Maggie wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. As an ER nurse, she prided herself on being pragmatic and logical, but she also had a reckless streak that made her curious. So on her night off, she decided to drive out to Hillcrest Road to see the infamous farmhouse for herself. The drive was longer than expected. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the winding back roads were shrouded in darkness. Her headlights barely cut through the mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. After 20 minutes of driving in near silence, her radio inexplicably filled with static, Maggie finally spotted the house. It sat at the end of a narrow gravel driveway, hidden behind a thicket of gnarled trees. The two-story structure was in ruins, its roof partially caved in and its windows dark and hollow. The porch sagged under the weight of years, and the entire property was cloaked in an unnatural stillness. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. Maggie parked her car near the gate and sat for a moment, staring at the house. Her stomach churned with unease, but she ignored it, chalking it up to adrenaline. She grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the cold night air. The crunch of gravel underfoot was the only sound as she approached the front door. Her flashlight flickered briefly, but she tapped it against her palm and the beam steadied. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as though the house were breathing, waiting for her to enter. "All right," she muttered to herself. 5 minutes, then I'm out." The front door was partially ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. Maggie pushed it open, and the rusty creak echoed through the house. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of rot. The beam of her flashlight revealed peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and a thick layer of dust that covered everything. She stepped into what had once been the living room. The remnants of a sofa sat near a cold, empty fireplace, and faded photographs hung crookedly on the walls. As Maggie shined her light on the pictures, a shiver ran down her spine. The faces in the photos were blurred, as though time itself had smudged them away. She moved cautiously through the house, her footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. In the dining room, a long wooden table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. A single candle holder stood at one end, its wax melted into a strange, jagged shape. Maggie turned toward the staircase, its banisters splintered and broken. She hesitated. Something about the upper floor felt wrong, though she couldn't explain why. Still, her curiosity got the better of her. She placed one foot on the first step, and the wood groaned under her weight. Halfway up the stairs, she heard it. A faint creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floor above her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she considered turning back, but she told herself it was probably just the house settling, or maybe an animal that had made its home inside. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The sound seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. The upstairs hallway was even darker than the first floor. The flashlight's beam revealed a series of closed doors, their paint chipped and peeling. Maggie approached the nearest one and hesitated before turning the knob. The door swung open to reveal a small bedroom. A child's bed sat in the corner, its metal frame rusted and the mattress bare. A doll lay on the floor, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. As Maggie stepped into the room, the temperature dropped. She could see her breath now, small puffs of white in the freezing air. A sudden, sharp noise made her spin around, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails on glass. Her flashlight darted to the window. There was nothing there, only the skeletal branches of a tree swaying in the faint breeze. But the tapping continued, louder now, insistent. It wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from behind her. Maggie whipped around, and the beam of her flashlight fell on the doll. It had been on the floor when she entered the room, but now it was sitting upright, its head tilted to the side. The empty eye socket seemed to stare directly at her. She backed out of the room, her breathing rapid. "This is stupid," she muttered, trying to steady herself. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something was wrong with this house. She turned back toward the staircase, ready to leave. But as she reached the top step, she heard a voice. "Maggie." The sound was barely above a whisper, but it froze her in place. She turned slowly, her flashlight shaking in her grip. The hallway behind her was empty, but the voice came again, closer this time. "Maggie." It was impossible. No one knew she was here. The rational part of her brain screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, the darkness pressing in on all sides. And then she saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long arms that seemed to stretch toward the floor. Its head tilted, mimicking the doll's, and though Maggie couldn't see its face, she felt its eyes boring into her. The figure began to move, its steps slow and deliberate. Maggie stumbled back, nearly tripping over the stairs. Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. "No," she whispered, fumbling to turn it back on. "No, no." When the light finally came back, the hallway was empty. The figure was gone. Maggie didn't wait to see if it would return. She bolted down the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. As she reached the front door, she felt something brush against her arm, cold, dry fingers that sent a jolt of terror through her. She burst outside, gasping for air, and sprinted to her car. Jumping into the driver's seat, she locked the doors and started the engine. The tires skidded on the gravel as she sped down the driveway, not daring to look back. It wasn't until she was miles away, back on the main road, that she allowed herself to breathe. Her hands trembled on the wheel, and her mind raced with what she had just experienced. She told herself she'd never go back to that house, that she'd warn anyone who might try. But as she glanced in the rearview mirror, her blood ran cold. In the faint reflection, she saw the doll from the bedroom, sitting on the back seat, its head tilted, its single eye staring directly at her. Story the end.
Story number 10.
It was a little after midnight when Jake pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin. The old, creaky structure stood at the edge of a dense forest, shrouded in mist that seemed to rise from the ground itself. He had rented it on a whim, a place to clear his head after a bad breakup. The website described it as rustic and peaceful, but in person it felt desolate, forgotten by time. The cabin's single porch light barely pierced the surrounding darkness. Jake shut off the car engine, grabbed his duffel bag, and made his way up the weathered steps. The air was unnervingly still, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under his boots. He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. Inside, the cabin was just as advertised: bare wooden walls, a small fireplace, and minimal furniture. Jake set his bag on the worn couch and glanced at his phone. No signal. He sighed. The isolation had seemed like a good idea at the time. Now, in the middle of nowhere, it felt suffocating. By 1 a.m., Jake had settled in. A small fire crackled in the hearth, and he sat on the couch with a glass of whiskey. The quiet was unnerving but manageable. He told himself he just needed to adjust. But then a soft noise broke the silence, a faint creak, like a footstep coming from outside the cabin. Jake froze, his glass halfway to his lips. He listened intently, straining to hear over the crackling fire. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate creak of wood. It was the porch. Someone or something was outside. He stood, heart pounding, and moved toward the window. The glass was fogged, but he could make out the faint shape of the porch railing. He saw nothing unusual, no movement, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at him. He grabbed the flashlight from his bag and cautiously opened the front door. "Hello?" he called into the night, his voice echoing unnaturally. The beam of the flashlight swept across the porch and the yard beyond. Nothing, just trees and mist. Jake stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. He walked the length of the porch, shining the light into the surrounding darkness. Still, nothing. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. He turned to go back inside, and that's when he saw it. On the far edge of the yard, near the tree line, stood a figure. It was too far away to make out details, but it was unmistakably a person. They stood unnaturally still, their silhouette blending with the shadows of the trees. Jake's stomach tightened. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice shaking slightly. "Who's there?" The figure didn't move. It didn't respond. Jake felt a chill creep down his spine. He raised the flashlight, the beam cutting through the fog. The figure was gone. Jake scanned the area, his heart racing. Had it been a trick of the light? His imagination? He didn't wait to find out. He retreated inside the cabin, locking the door behind him. His breathing was ragged as he leaned against the door, trying to convince himself that he was just tired, that the isolation was playing tricks on him. The fire had dimmed, casting long shadows across the room. Jake poured himself another glass of whiskey, trying to shake the unease. But then he heard it again, the creak of the porch. This time it was followed by a slow, deliberate knock on the door. Jake's blood turned to ice. He stared at the door, his mind racing. Who would be out here at this hour? His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but then he stopped. Something about the knock felt wrong, too deliberate, too slow. It wasn't the knock of someone seeking help. He backed away from the door, his eyes fixed on it. The knock came again, louder this time. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed the poker from the fireplace, holding it like a weapon. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. No response, just silence. The knocking stopped, but the silence felt worse. Jake stood frozen, every muscle in his body tense. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, he worked up the courage to approach the door. He peered through the peephole, his heart hammering. Nothing. The porch was empty. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. As he turned away, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. He spun around, and his stomach dropped. The figure was inside the cabin, standing in the far corner of the room. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black voids that seemed to absorb the light. She wore a tattered dress that clung to her skeletal frame, and her head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if her neck were broken. Jake's legs felt like they were made of lead. He tried to move, to run, but he couldn't. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and jerky, like a puppet on strings. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and a chilling smile spread across her face. "Why did you come here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible but cutting through the air like a blade. Jake couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The woman took another step, and then another, until she was only a few feet away. "Leave," she hissed, her voice now a guttural growl. Jake didn't need to be told twice. His paralysis broke, and he bolted for the door. He flung it open and ran into the night, not daring to look back. The forest closed in around him, branches clawing at his skin as he stumbled blindly through the darkness. He didn't stop until he reached his car. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door. He threw himself inside, started the engine, and sped away, gravel spraying behind him. Jake didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. He pulled into a gas station and sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He told himself he would never go back to that cabin, never speak of what he saw. But as he stepped out of the car, he froze. On the back window, written in condensation, were 3 words: "I'm still here." Story the end.